The millionaire froze as he saw the birthmark on the driver's arm. The same one his son had when he disappeared 15 years ago. In sunny Los Angeles, California, Eric Decker was known by all as the Concrete King. At 55, he commanded one of the largest real estate empires in the country. Tall, modern buildings stretched across the city, all with the Vance name emblazoned in golden letters. But behind the glow of success, Eric hid a deep pain. 15 years ago, his son Miguel, a joyful 8-year-old boy, vanished without a trace. That fateful day still haunted his thoughts. It was a sunny Sunday. Eric had promised to take Miguel to the park, but a last-minute meeting got in the way. "It'll be quick, son. Mom will go with you, and I'll meet you there," he said, tousling the boy's hair. It was the last time he saw Miguel's smile. Hours later, he received a frantic call from Isabel, his wife. Miguel was gone. "A second of distraction," she said, and the boy was no longer there. The police were called, searches were conducted, posters were plastered all over the city. But Miguel seemed to have disappeared into thin air. The following years were agonizing. Isabel, consumed by guilt and sorrow, fell ill. Eric buried himself in work, as if building more and more could somehow fill the void left by his son. The couple grew distant, each coping with the pain in their own way. 5 years after Miguel's disappearance, Isabel passed away. The doctors said it was a heart attack, but Eric knew she had died of a broken heart. At the funeral, he found himself alone, surrounded by people he barely knew. Partners, employees, politicians, all there out of obligation, none out of affection. Since then, Eric had become a shadow of the man he once was. His routine was always the same: wake up at sunrise, work late into the night, sleep for a few hours, and repeat it all the next day. He was feared by his employees, respected by his competitors, but no one truly knew him. His office, perched high in a skyscraper, offered a view of all of Los Angeles. Sometimes, Eric would find himself staring out at the city, wondering if Miguel was still out there somewhere. In those moments, he felt the weight of the years and the missed opportunities. On the wall of his office, a family photo stood out. In it, a younger Eric smiled next to Isabel, with Miguel in his arms. It was the only personal photo in the cold, impersonal space. Sometimes, he wondered if the smiling man in the photo still existed somewhere inside him. Years passed, and Eric kept building his empire. Every new building, every new contract, seemed like an attempt to construct something that could replace what he had lost. But at the end of the day, when he returned to his empty penthouse, reality hit him: all the money and power in the world couldn't bring back what he wanted most. Eric Decker had everything money could buy, but he lived in a world without color, without joy. He was the king of a concrete and glass empire, but his heart was as empty as the apartments he built. And so, day after day, he continued, waiting for something that might bring meaning back into his life. It was a morning like any other at Vance Enterprises. Employees hurried in, fearing Eric's stern gaze. But that day, there was something different in the air. A 23-year-old named Dylan Harris was starting his first day as the personal driver of the feared businessman. Dylan adjusted his tie for the 10th time, nervous. He knew this opportunity could change his life. Growing up in a humble neighborhood, Dylan had big dreams, but doors always seemed to be closed to him. Until now. "Mr. Harris," called Eric's secretary. "Mr. Vance will see you now." With a nervous smile, Dylan entered the office. Eric stood with his back to him, staring out the window. When he turned around, his cold gaze made Dylan swallow hard. "So, you're the new driver," Eric said, his voice emotionless. I expect you to be punctual and discreet. I don't tolerate lateness or gossip. Yes, sir, Dylan replied, trying to keep his voice steady. You can count on me. Eric simply nodded, turning his attention back to the papers on his desk. Dylan understood that he was dismissed. In the days that followed, Dylan worked hard to impress. He always arrived half an hour early, kept the car spotless, and memorized all the routes. But Eric seemed not to notice. His only words were short, curt commands. Despite this, Dylan didn't lose heart. His cheerful and optimistic nature was stronger. He chatted happily with other employees, always with a smile and a joke ready to go. How do you manage to work for Mr. Vance? One of the secretaries asked him one day. He's so cold. Dylan shrugged. Everyone's got a story, right? Maybe he just needs someone who understands him. This positive attitude didn't go unnoticed. The employees, used to the tense environment, began to like Dylan. His presence brought a bit of light to the gloomy hallways of the company. One day, during a particularly long drive, Dylan gathered the courage to try and start a conversation with Eric. Beautiful view, isn't it, sir? He commented, glancing in the rearview mirror. Eric, surprised by the initiative, merely grunted in response. But Dylan didn't give up. You know, my dad always said the best conversations happen on long trips, he continued. Something about the motion of the car that gets people talking. For a moment, Dylan thought he saw a flicker of interest in Eric's eyes. But the businessman quickly returned his attention to his phone, ending the conversation. Even so, something had changed. In the following days, Eric seemed to watch Dylan more closely. Not that his behavior had become friendlier, but there was a curiosity in his gaze. The other employees noticed the change. Careful, Dylan, a colleague warned. The boss doesn't like people getting too close. But Dylan didn't care about the warnings. He saw something in Eric's eyes that others didn't. A sadness, a loneliness he recognized. Everyone needs a friend, Dylan thought. Even the mighty Eric Vance. And so, day after day, trip after trip, Dylan kept trying. A comment here, a joke there. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the ice began to melt. Eric was still the feared boss, the ruthless businessman. But when he got into the car and saw Dylan's warm smile in the rearview mirror, something inside him softened. A feeling almost forgotten, that maybe, just maybe, there was still room for a little light in his dark life. Dylan left work that evening with a smile on his face. Despite the exhausting day, he couldn't wait to see Chloe, his girlfriend. She worked as a cleaner in a nearby building, and they always met after their shifts. Chloe was waiting at their usual corner, her long black hair tied up in a ponytail. At 18, she had a youthful and vibrant beauty that contrasted with the tired expression on her face. Hey, love, Dylan greeted her with a kiss. How was your day? Chloe shrugged. The usual. Cleaning, cleaning, and more cleaning. How about you? Oh, it was great. Dylan replied excitedly. You know, I think Mr. Vance is starting to like me. Chloe's eyes lit up with interest. The millionaire? Really? Dylan nodded, not noticing the sudden change in her tone. Yeah, he even smiled today when I told a joke. Well, more like a half smile, but still, it's progress, right? As they walked home, Chloe was deep in thought. She had always dreamed of escaping the hard life she lived, and suddenly, through Dylan, an opportunity seemed to be emerging. "Dylan," she started hesitantly, "do you think Mr. Vance could get me a better job? Maybe at his company?" Dylan frowned. "I don't know, love. I've just started there, and—" "But you said he's starting to like you," Chloe insisted. "It wouldn't hurt to ask, would it?" Dylan felt uneasy. He loved Chloe, but sometimes it felt like she wanted things to move too fast. "Let's take it slow, okay? Let me get settled at work first." Chloe pouted but didn't push further. Inside, though, her mind was already working on plans and possibilities. In the days that followed, their relationship began to shift subtly. Whenever Dylan talked about his job, Chloe seemed more interested. She asked questions about Eric, the company, and the important people Dylan was meeting. "Love, why do you want to know so much about all this?" Dylan asked one night, feeling uneasy. "I'm just interested in your life, silly," Chloe replied with a sweet smile. But there was something in her eyes that Dylan didn't recognize. Dylan started feeling conflicted. He loved Chloe, adored how she made him laugh, how her eyes sparkled when she was happy. But he also sensed that something was off. The constant questions, her sudden interest in his work, it all made him uncomfortable. One night, after a simple dinner in their small apartment, Chloe brought up the topic again. "Dylan, it's been weeks. Don't you think it's time to talk to Mr. Vance about a job for me?" Dylan sighed. "Chloe, I've already told you. I can't just go in and ask for that. Besides, don't you think we're doing fine as we are? We have each other, we have our jobs." "Our jobs?" Chloe laughed bitterly. "You call scrubbing other people's floors a job? I deserve more, Dylan. We deserve more." It was the first time they had a real argument. Dylan tried to explain that things take time, that he wanted to earn his place on his own merit. Chloe, on the other hand, couldn't understand why he wasn't seizing the opportunity right in front of him. That night, lying in bed while Chloe slept, Dylan found himself thinking. He loved his girlfriend, but did he really know her? Were her dreams and ambitions compatible with his? Dylan had always been honest and hardworking. The idea of using his position to get favors deeply bothered him. But he also didn't want to disappoint Chloe. He felt torn between his love for her and his own values. As the days passed, Dylan felt the weight of the situation. At work, he continued being cheerful and dedicated, earning more and more of Eric's trust. But at home, things were tense. Chloe alternated between moments of affection and subtle demands. Dylan wondered if he could ever balance his love for Chloe with his principles. Little did he know, future events would test not only their relationship but everything he believed in. The day dawned with a different feeling in the air. Eric had an important business trip to close a big deal in Barcelona, and as always, Dylan was ready to drive him. "Good morning, Mr. Vance," Dylan greeted him with his usual smile. Eric only nodded, his mind already focused on the meeting ahead. The trip started off smoothly. Dylan drove carefully, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror at his boss, who was working intensely on his laptop. Suddenly, a car cut in front of them sharply. Dylan reacted quickly, skillfully swerving and avoiding an accident. The sudden movement caused Eric to shout in surprise, his laptop slipping out of his hands. "Are you all right, sir?" Dylan asked, concerned, as he pulled over to the side of the road. Eric, still catching his breath, nodded. "Quick reflexes, Harris. You saved us from a serious accident." It was at that moment, While Eric leaned down to pick up the laptop from the car floor, something caught his eye. Dylan's shirt sleeve had ridden up a bit, revealing a birthmark on his arm. Eric froze. That mark. It was identical to the one his missing son, Miguel, had. A crescent-shaped mark so unique and familiar that it made his heart stop for a moment. "Mr. Vance? Are you sure you're okay?" Dylan's concerned voice brought him back to reality. Eric shook his head, trying to compose himself. Yes. Just a bit shaken up by the scare. But his eyes couldn't look away from that mark. The rest of the trip was a blur for Eric. His mind was spinning. Could it just be a coincidence? After all, birthmarks weren't that rare. But the resemblance was too striking to ignore. He started observing Dylan more closely. The young driver was 23. The same age Miguel would have been if he were still alive. And there was something in his smile, the way his eyes lit up when he spoke, that reminded Eric so much of Isabel. Eric found himself asking questions he had never asked before. "Dylan, are you really from Los Angeles?" Dylan, surprised by the sudden interest, replied, "Actually, no sir. I grew up in San Diego. I came to Los Angeles looking for opportunities." Every new piece of information felt like a puzzle Eric didn't even realize he was solving. He wanted to ask more, to know everything about Dylan's past, but something held him back. Maybe it was the fear of raising false hopes. When they arrived in Barcelona, Eric was so distracted that he almost forgot the reason for the trip. During the meeting, his thoughts kept drifting back to Dylan and that mark on his arm. Back at the hotel, Eric couldn't sleep. He kept replaying in his mind every detail he had noticed about Dylan. His way of speaking, his gestures, even his tone of voice. Everything now seemed so familiar. The next morning, during breakfast, Eric couldn't take his eyes off Dylan, who was waiting patiently at a nearby table. The young man noticed his boss's intense gaze and smiled gently, unaware of what was going on. That smile was like a knife to Eric's heart. It was Miguel's smile, the same one he saw every night in his dreams for the past 15 years. On the way back to Los Angeles, Eric was different. Quieter, more thoughtful. Dylan noticed the change but attributed it to travel fatigue. "Mr. Vance, would you like me to play some music?" Dylan asked, trying to ease the tense atmosphere. "No, thank you," Eric responded softly, something rare in his usually harsh tone. "Just tell me more about yourself, Dylan. What was your childhood in San Diego like?" The question caught Dylan off guard. It was the first time Eric had shown interest in his personal life. As Dylan spoke about his childhood, Eric listened intently, his heart racing with every new piece of information. By the time they arrived in Los Angeles, Eric had made up his mind. He needed to know more. He needed to be sure. Years of pain and loneliness had hardened his heart, but now, for the first time in a long while, he felt something different, hope. Eric couldn't get the image of Dylan's birthmark out of his head. The possibility that his driver could be the son he had lost so long ago consumed him. But he knew he couldn't act on impulse. He needed proof, certainty. With trembling hands, Eric picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Ramon? It's Eric Vance. I need your services again." Ramon was a private investigator Eric had hired back when Miguel disappeared. Now, 15 years later, he was back on the case. "I want you to look into everything about Dylan Harris," Eric instructed. "His childhood in San Diego, his family, everything. And be discreet. While Ramon began his investigation, Eric started his own silent research. He watched Dylan closely, looking for any signs, any resemblance to the boy he had lost. At work, Eric began including Dylan in more activities. "Harris, come with me to this meeting," he would say, or, "Dylan, what do you think about this project?" Every interaction was an opportunity to study the young man. Dylan, on the other hand, was surprised and a little confused by his boss's sudden change in attitude. "Chloe, it's strange," he mentioned to his girlfriend one night. "Mr. Vance is different. Almost friendly." Chloe's eyes lit up with interest. "That's great, babe. Maybe now's the time to ask for that favor we talked about." Dylan frowned, feeling uneasy. "I don't know, it doesn't seem right to take advantage like that." But Chloe insisted, planting the seed of ambition in Dylan. "Think of the opportunities, the future we could have." Meanwhile, Ramon's first findings started to come in. Dylan was raised by a man named James Martin, the detective reported. Apparently, there are no records of his mother. Each new piece of information made Eric's heart beat faster. He wanted to confront Dylan, ask him directly about his past, but the fear of being wrong, of reliving the pain of loss, held him back. In the office, the employees began to notice the change in Eric's behavior. The boss, who had always been so cold and distant, now seemed almost human. Especially when he was near Dylan. "Have you seen the way Mr. Vance looks at Dylan?" a secretary whispered to another. "It's like he's seen a ghost." Aware of the whispers, Eric tried to maintain his usual composure. But it was difficult. Every time he saw Dylan, his heart tightened with a mixture of hope and fear. One day, during a business lunch, Eric decided to subtly test Dylan. "So, Dylan, you mentioned you didn't know your mother. What was it like growing up with just your father?" Dylan, surprised by the personal question, hesitated for a moment. "Well, Mr. Vance, it wasn't easy. James, my father, did the best he could, but I always felt like something was missing, you know?" Eric nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. It was exactly how he imagined Miguel would feel if he were alive, growing up without knowing his real parents. As the days passed, Eric found himself growing closer to Dylan. He started to see in the young man not just a possible lost son but a person he genuinely cared about. Dylan, on the other hand, was confused by the new dynamic. On one hand, he appreciated the attention and the opportunity to learn from Eric. On the other hand, he felt the weight of Chloe's expectations on his shoulders. "Babe, Mr. Vance clearly likes you now," Chloe insisted. "Why don't you take advantage and ask for a promotion? Or at least recommend me for a better job?" Dylan found himself torn between his integrity and the desire to please Chloe. "I promise I'll think about it," he replied, without much conviction. Meanwhile, Eric continued his silent investigation, piecing together a puzzle that could change his life forever. Every new detail about Dylan's past made him more convinced, but also more apprehensive. And so, with the curious glances of the employees, the pressure from Chloe, and Eric's secret investigations, the stage was set for revelations that would change the course of many lives. As the days went by, Dylan found himself increasingly intrigued by Eric's sudden interest in his life. The questions about his past, though subtle, were frequent and sometimes surprisingly personal. One afternoon, while driving Eric to a meeting, Dylan decided to satisfy his boss's curiosity. "You know, Mr. Vance, you've been asking a lot about my childhood. I think I can share a bit more." Eric, trying to hide his anxiety, simply nodded, encouraging Dylan to continue. "Well, as I mentioned before, I grew up in San Diego with my father, James Martin. He was a complicated man, Dylan began, his voice mixing nostalgia with a hint of sadness. He worked a lot, always said it was to give me a better life. As Dylan spoke, fragments of memories surfaced in his mind. He remembered a simple house on the outskirts of San Diego, the scent of orange trees in the backyard, and the tired figure of James coming home late from work. My father never talked about my mother, Dylan continued. Whenever I asked, he'd change the subject or say she left when I was too young to remember. Eric listened intently, his heart racing with every new piece of information. He wanted to ask more, question every detail, but he restrained himself, allowing Dylan to tell his story at his own pace. I had a normal childhood, I guess. Played in the street with the neighbors, went to school. Dylan paused, as if searching his memory for something more meaningful. But I always felt like something was missing, you know? That sentence made Eric hold his breath. It was exactly what he imagined Miguel would have felt if he had grown up far from his real family. Dylan continued, talking about his school years, how he had always been good at drawing and dreamed of becoming an architect. My father didn't really get it. He wanted me to have a real job, as he used to say. As Eric listened, he couldn't help but notice the similarities between Dylan and Isabel. The same passion for art, the same sparkle in his eyes when he mentioned architecture. Isabel had been a talented artist before she dedicated herself to the family. When I turned 18, Dylan went on, I decided it was time to find my own way. I came to Los Angeles with little more than the clothes on my back and a lot of dreams. Eric noticed a tone of pride in Dylan's voice. It was the same kind of determination Eric had when he was younger, the same drive to conquer the world. It was tough at first, Dylan admitted. I did a bit of everything. Worked in restaurants, on construction sites, until I landed the job as a driver at your company. As he heard about Dylan's struggles, Eric felt a mix of pride and guilt. Pride for the young man's perseverance, guilt for not having been there to help him, if he truly was his son. And here I am, Dylan concluded with a smile. I'm not an architect yet, but I haven't given up on that dream. Maybe one day. The car fell silent for a few moments. Eric was absorbing everything he had heard, connecting dots, imagining possibilities. Thank you for sharing your story, Dylan, Eric finally said, his voice softer than usual. You're quite a remarkable young man. Dylan, surprised by the compliment, simply thanked him shyly. That night, alone in his office, Eric mentally replayed every detail of Dylan's story. The absence of a mother, the distant figure of the father, the feeling that something was missing. Everything seemed to fit. But there were still missing pieces in the puzzle. Who was James Martin, really? How had Dylan ended up in San Diego? And why, after all these years, had fate brought them together? Eric knew he needed more information. He picked up the phone and called Ramon, the detective. I need you to find out everything you can about James Martin, he instructed. Every detail of his life over the past 15 years. Meanwhile, in his small apartment, Dylan was telling Chloe about his conversation with Eric. He seemed really interested in my story, Dylan said, still surprised. Chloe, listening intently, saw an opportunity. See? He likes you. Now's the perfect time to ask for that promotion. Dylan sighed, feeling torn between his desire to please Chloe and his discomfort with taking advantage of the situation. Little did he know, his origins were about to be revealed, changing the course of his life forever. Eric's phone rang early that morning. It was Ramon, the detective, with new information about James Martin. Eric felt his heart race as he listened. "Mr. Vance, I've uncovered something interesting," Ramon said. "James Martin worked for your company about 16 years ago." Eric nearly dropped the phone. "What? How do I not remember this?" "He was a low-level employee, sir. Worked in the maintenance department," Ramon explained. "He was fired on suspicion of fraud, just before your son disappeared." Eric's mind was spinning. Distant memories began to resurface. He vaguely recalled an incident, accusations of stealing construction materials. At the time, it seemed trivial compared to the tragedy that followed. "There's more," Ramon continued. "After he was fired, Martin disappeared for a few months. He resurfaced in San Dillon with a young boy, claiming the child was his." Eric felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under him. Everything was starting to make a terrible kind of sense. That day, Eric could barely focus on work. Every time he saw Dylan, a storm of emotions overwhelmed him. Anger at having been deceived for so long, joy at the possibility of finding his son, and fear that he might be wrong. Dylan, on the other hand, began to notice changes in himself. Fragments of memories, strange dreams that felt more like recollections than fantasies, started to surface. One night, he woke up with a start, drenched in sweat. In the dream, he had been in a park, running and laughing. But it wasn't James calling his name, it was a man he didn't recognize, yet who seemed strangely familiar. "Are you okay, love?" Chloe asked, waking up from Dylan's sudden movement. "Yeah, just a weird dream," he replied, still confused. Chloe noticed Dylan's troubled expression. "Do you want to talk about it?" Dylan hesitated. Lately, he felt like he couldn't share everything with Chloe. Her constant questions about Eric and the company made him uncomfortable. "It's nothing," he finally said. "Let's go back to sleep." The next day, at the office, Eric called Dylan in for a private conversation. The young man entered the room nervously, wondering if he was finally getting the promotion Chloe had been urging him to ask for. "Dylan," Eric began, his voice softer than usual, "do you remember anything about your life before San Diego?" The question caught Dylan off guard. I don't know, sir." "Why?" Eric took a deep breath, carefully choosing his next words. "I have reason to believe that your story may be more complicated than you realize." Dylan felt a knot in his stomach. Suddenly, all those strange dreams, the constant feeling that something was missing, seemed to make sense. "What do you mean?" Dylan asked, his voice trembling slightly. Eric was about to respond when they were interrupted by an urgent call. A problem at one of the construction sites required immediate attention. "We'll continue this conversation later," Eric said, clearly frustrated by the interruption. Dylan left the office with his head spinning. What did Eric know that he didn't? Why all the questions about his past? Meanwhile, Chloe, growing impatient with Dylan's lack of progress in securing a promotion, decided to take matters into her own hands. She showed up at the office unannounced, determined to speak directly with Eric. "Sorry, miss, but Mr. Vance is busy," the secretary said, blocking her way. "I'm Dylan's girlfriend," Chloe insisted. "I'm sure he'll want to see me." The mention of Dylan's name caught Eric's attention as he was heading out to the construction site. He saw Chloe arguing with the secretary and, for a moment, thought he saw Isabel. The resemblance was striking. "It's okay," Eric said, approaching. "I'll speak with her." Chloe smiled, thinking her plan was working. But Eric's look was not welcoming. It was one of suspicion, almost hostility. "So, you're Dylan's girlfriend," he said, his voice cold. "Interesting that you show up now." Chloe sensed something was wrong. This wasn't the encounter she had imagined. Eric, staring at Chloe, couldn't stop thinking about all the missing pieces of the puzzle. Who was this girl really? What was her role in this complicated story? The tension in the air was palpable. Chloe, Dylan, Eric, each trapped in a web of secrets and half-truths that threatened to unravel at any moment. The unexpected meeting between Chloe and Eric in the office created a tense atmosphere that hung over everyone. Eric, with his serious and calculating expression, invited Chloe to a conversation in his private office. "So, Chloe," Eric began, his voice cold and controlled, "what brings you here today?" Chloe, initially confident, now felt small under Eric's piercing gaze. She swallowed hard before answering. I came to talk about Dylan, sir." Eric raised an eyebrow. "Dylan? And what exactly do you want to say about him?" Chloe gathered all her courage. It was now or never. "Mr. Vance, Dylan is an exemplary employee. He works hard, is dedicated, and deserves a better opportunity. I thought maybe you could consider promoting him." Eric listened carefully, his face a mask of impenetrability. Internally, however, his mind was racing. He could see through Chloe's words, sensing the barely hidden ambition behind her request. "And you came here, without Dylan's knowledge, to tell me this?" Eric asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Chloe hesitated for a moment. "Well, Dylan is very modest. He would never ask for this himself." Eric leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Chloe. "And what do you get out of this, Chloe? What's your real interest in this situation?" The direct question caught Chloe off guard. She felt her cheeks flush. I just want the best for Dylan, Mr. Vance." Eric wasn't convinced. He could sense there was more to the story than Chloe was letting on. "Chloe, let me be direct with you. I see that you have ambitions of your own. What exactly do you expect to gain from Dylan's promotion?" Eric's words hit Chloe like a slap. She felt exposed, her intentions laid bare. For a moment, she considered maintaining her facade, but something in Eric's gaze made her reconsider. "All right," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes, I have ambitions. I want a better life, for me and for Dylan. Is that so wrong?" Eric listened, his face a mixture of disappointment and understanding. "No, it's not wrong to have ambitions. But using Dylan as a means to achieve them, that's questionable." Eric's words cut deep. Chloe had never thought of her actions that way. "I love Dylan," she said, more to herself than to Eric. "Love?" Eric asked, his voice softening slightly. "Or the idea of what Dylan could become?" The silence that followed was deafening. Chloe found herself confronting her own motivations for the first time. Meanwhile, Dylan, unaware of Chloe's visit, continued his work. But his mind was elsewhere, still unsettled by the interrupted conversation with Eric earlier. What did his boss mean about his story being more complicated? When Dylan finally found out that Chloe had gone to see Eric, he was shocked. "How could you do that without telling me?" he asked, his voice a mix of hurt and anger. "I just wanted to help, Dylan," Chloe replied, tears in her eyes. "You deserve more than just being a driver." Dylan shook his head in disbelief. "It wasn't your place to do that, Chloe. Don't you understand? I want to earn things on my own, not through favors or pressure. The argument between Dylan and Chloe dragged on through the night. For the first time, Dylan saw Chloe's ambition clearly, and it scared him. He had always known that she dreamed of a better life, but he never imagined she would go this far. "I thought we were in this together," Dylan said, his voice tired. "But now I see we have very different views of what that means." Chloe, realizing the mistake she had made, tried to explain. "Dylan, I just wanted the best for us. Don't you see that I'm thinking about our future?" But Dylan wasn't sure anymore if the future Chloe envisioned was the same as what he wanted. The next day, the atmosphere at the office was heavy. Eric watched Dylan from a distance, noticing his downcast expression. He wanted to continue the conversation they had started, to reveal his suspicions about Dylan's past, but now didn't seem like the right time. Dylan, for his part, felt lost. The revelations about Chloe's ambitions, combined with Eric's mysterious hints about his past, left him confused and unsure. As the day progressed, it became clear to everyone that something had changed. The tension in the air was palpable, and everyone was left wondering what would happen next. Eric's office was silent, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. He held a yellowed envelope in his hands, just delivered by Ramon, the detective. His heart raced as he stared at the handwritten name on the envelope, "For Dylan." With trembling hands, Eric opened the envelope and began to read the letter James Martin had left for Dylan before he died. Each word seemed to leap off the page, revealing a truth Eric both feared and had longed for. "My dear Dylan," the letter began, or should I say, Miguel. "There's so much I need to tell you, so many secrets I've carried for years." Eric felt the air leave his lungs. There it was, in black and white, the confirmation of his suspicions. Dylan was indeed Miguel, his lost son. The letter went on, detailing how James, driven by bitterness and a desire for revenge after being fired, had kidnapped Miguel. It explained how, over the years, guilt consumed him, but the fear of being caught and the love he developed for the child kept him from revealing the truth. "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness," the letter continued, "but I hope one day you can understand. You are always and will always be my son, even if not by blood." Eric let the letter fall onto the desk, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Anger for being robbed of so many years with his son, relief for finally knowing the truth, and a deep sadness for the time lost. Meanwhile, unaware of the storm brewing, Dylan arrived at work. His thoughts were still on the argument with Chloe from the night before. He felt betrayed, used. Her ambitions now seemed so clear, so glaring. As he entered the office, Dylan immediately noticed something was different. The staff whispered to each other, casting glances his way. Even Eric's secretary seemed to avoid making eye contact with him. "Dylan," Eric's voice came over the intercom, "please come to my office." With a knot in his stomach, Dylan complied. As he entered the office, he was met by an Eric who seemed to have aged years overnight. "Please, sit down," Eric said, his voice soft, almost broken. Dylan obeyed, sensing that he was about to hear something that would change his life forever. "Dylan, there's something I need to tell you," Eric began, his hands restless on the desk. "It's about your past, about who you really are." Eric's next words hit like bombs. Dylan listened in disbelief as Eric spoke about James, the kidnapping, and his true identity as Michael Vance. This can't be true," Dylan stammered, feeling the world spin around him. Eric slid the letter toward Dylan. "Read it. It's James's confession." With trembling hands, Dylan took the letter. Every word felt like a dagger to his heart. Long-buried memories began to surface, flashes of a park, of a woman smiling, of a house different from the one he knew in San Diego. I need some air," Dylan said, standing up abruptly. Eric made a move to follow him but stopped. He knew that Miguel needed time to process all of this. Dylan left the office in a daze, ignoring the curious glances of his colleagues. He wandered aimlessly through the streets of Los Angeles, his mind a storm of thoughts and emotions. Who was he, really? Dylan Harris or Michael Vance? The son of a humble man from San Diego or the heir to a real estate empire? All his memories, his entire identity, now felt like an elaborate lie. Without realizing it, his steps led him to the small apartment he shared with Chloe. She was there, waiting, her eyes red from crying. "Dylan, I'm so sorry," she began, but he cut her off with a gesture. "Not now, Chloe," he said, his voice distant. I need to be alone." Chloe watched, helpless, as Dylan gathered some clothes and left again. She didn't understand what was happening, but she could feel that something fundamental had changed. Back at his office, Eric wrestled with his own demons. The joy of finding his son was tainted by guilt. If he hadn't fired James so mercilessly, maybe none of this would have happened. That night, 3 tormented souls sought answers. Dylan, wandering the streets of Los Angeles, trying to reconcile 2 completely different lives. Eric, in his office, replaying every decision that had led to this moment. And Chloe, alone in the apartment, realizing that her ambitions might have cost her the love of her life. The truth, long buried, had finally come to light. But instead of bringing clarity, it seemed to have only complicated things further. The future, once so certain, now felt uncertain and frightening for everyone involved. The sun had barely risen when Dylan returned to Eric's office. He had spent the entire night wandering the streets of Los Angeles, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. Now, with dark circles under his eyes and a heavy heart, he was ready to face the truth. Eric was already there, as if he had never left. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, now reflected a mixture of hope and fear. "Dylan." "Miguel," Eric began hesitantly. "Please," Dylan interrupted, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Just Dylan, for now." Eric nodded, respecting the request. "Dylan, I know this is a lot to process. But you need to hear the whole truth." In the hours that followed, Eric told everything. The day of the disappearance, the desperate search, the years of anguish and guilt. Dylan listened in silence, occasionally closing his eyes as if trying to access memories long buried. "I remember." Vaguely, Dylan finally spoke. "A park, a woman smiling. My mother?" Eric felt tears well up in his eyes. "Yes, Isabel. She couldn't bear the pain of losing you." The revelation hit Dylan like a punch. Not only had he lost his real parents, but his mother had died believing he was lost forever. "Why?" Dylan asked, his voice trembling with emotion. "Why did James do this?" Eric took a deep breath. "I fired him, Dylan. Unjustly and cruelly. He wanted revenge, and he took you as a way to punish me." Anger surged in Dylan's chest. "So, it's your fault? All of this happened because of you?" The words hit Eric like knives. "Yes," he admitted, guilt evident in his voice. "I was a different man back then. Ruthless in business, without caring about the consequences of my actions." Dylan stood up abruptly, unable to contain his agitation. "You destroyed my life. James's life. All because of your damn pride." Eric didn't try to defend himself. He knew he deserved every word of accusation. "You're right, Dylan. I was a monster. Losing you. Losing Isabel. It changed me. But I know nothing can undo what I did." The silence that followed was deafening. Dylan stared out the window, the city lights beginning to flicker in the twilight. His mind was flooded with confusing images, memories of his childhood with James mixed with flashes of a life he could barely remember. "And now?" Dylan finally asked, his voice calmer but still filled with emotion. "What happens now?" Eric approached him hesitantly. "That's up to you, Dylan. I would like to try to be your father, if you give me the chance. But I understand if you want nothing to do with me." Dylan turned, facing Eric. For the first time, he really looked at the man in front of him. Not the powerful businessman, not the feared boss, but a father who had lost everything and now had a chance at redemption. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Dylan said honestly. "I don't know if I can forgive James. I don't even know who I am anymore." Eric nodded, understanding. "I get it. I just ask that you give me the chance to try to make things right. Not to erase the past, but to build a future." At that moment, the office door abruptly opened. Chloe entered, her eyes red from crying. "Dylan. I finally found you. What's going on?" Chloe's arrival added a new layer of complexity to the situation. Dylan found himself torn between his life as Dylan Harris, with Chloe and their simple dreams, and the possibility of a new life as Michael Vance, heir to an empire. "Chloe," Dylan began, his voice tired. "There's something you need to know." In the minutes that followed, Dylan, with occasional help from Eric, explained the whole situation to Chloe. She listened in shock, her eyes darting between Dylan and Eric. "So, you're rich now?" was Chloe's first question, her eyes gleaming with a mix of surprise and calculation. The question hit Dylan like a slap. He realized, in that moment, that Chloe had never truly known him, never really loved him for who he was. "Is that all that matters to you?" Dylan asked, his voice filled with disappointment. Chloe realized her mistake too late. "No, Dylan, I didn't mean." But the damage was done. Dylan looked at Eric, then at Chloe, feeling the weight of two lives, of two identities, pressing down on his shoulders. "I need time," he finally said. "Time to think, to figure out who I really am." With those words, Dylan walked out of the office, leaving behind an Eric filled with remorse and hope, and a Chloe who was finally realizing what her ambition had cost her. The sun was rising over Los Angeles as Dylan boarded the train to San Diego. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions, but he knew he had to return to his roots, or at least, to what he had always believed were his roots, to find answers. The trip was long and quiet. Dylan spent hours staring out the window, watching the landscape change, much like how his life had changed so drastically in the past few days. Occasionally, he would pull out James' letter, rereading the words that had turned his world upside down. When he arrived in San Diego, Dylan went straight to the small house where he had grown up. Every step down the familiar streets brought a mix of comfort and strangeness. It was as if he were seeing everything with new eyes. The house was just as he remembered it, a bit worn by time, but still standing. Dylan used the key he always carried with him and stepped inside. The familiar smell hit him immediately, bringing a wave of memories. He spent hours exploring every room, every corner. On the kitchen table, he found more letters from James, addressed to him. With trembling hands, Dylan began to read. The letters were a testament to James' internal struggle. The regret over the kidnapping, the constant fear of being discovered, but also the genuine love he had developed for Dylan over the years. "My son," one of the letters said, "I know I don't have the right to call you that, but it's how I've always seen you. I hope one day you can forgive me." Dylan felt tears welling up in his eyes. The anger he had initially felt toward James was slowly being replaced by a complicated mix of compassion and sadness. Meanwhile, back in Los Angeles, Eric was restless. He respected Dylan's need to find answers on his own, but the fatherly concern he never had the chance to express was consuming him. Chloe, on the other hand, was desperate. She had been trying incessantly to reach Dylan, leaving messages and calling repeatedly. Her regret over her selfish actions was genuine, but it had come too late. Back in San Diego, Dylan decided to visit old neighbors and family friends. Each conversation brought new perspectives on James and on his own childhood. "James always seemed to carry a heavy burden," an old neighbor remarked. "But his love for you, Dylan, was undeniable." Those words echoed in Dylan's mind. The man he had called father for so many years wasn't a monster, but a complex human being who had made a terrible mistake and spent the rest of his life trying to atone for it. On the third day in San Diego, Dylan found something that changed everything. Hidden in the back of a closet was a small chest. Inside were old photos, newspaper clippings about his disappearance, and a diary. The diary was James, detailing the years since the kidnapping. Dylan spent the entire night reading, his vision blurred by tears. "Today Miguel smiled at me for the first time," one entry read. "I felt like my heart was going to burst with joy and guilt at the same time." With each page, Dylan gained more insight into the man who had raised him. The guilt that consumed him, the constant fear, but also the genuine love that had developed. On the last page of the diary, dated just a few days before James' death, there was a final confession. "Miguel, no, Dylan, as I decided to call you, I hope one day you learn the truth. I don't ask for your forgiveness, because I know I don't deserve it. But know that despite everything, you were the best thing that ever happened to me. I love you, my son, even if not by blood." Dylan closed the diary, feeling as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He still didn't have all the answers, but now he understood both James and himself a little better. With a heavy, yet lighter heart at the same time, Dylan picked up the phone. It was time to return to Los Angeles and face both his past and his future. "Eric," he said when the businessman answered, "I'm coming back. I think we need to talk." On the other end of the line, Eric felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Dylan's Miguel's journey was far from over, but a new chapter was about to begin. The weeks that followed were an emotional roller coaster for Dylan and Eric. Rebuilding a father-son relationship after 15 years of separation wasn't easy, but both were determined to try. Dylan decided to keep his job at the company, but now in a different position. Eric placed him in the architecture department, giving Dylan a chance to pursue his dream while learning about the family business. The first few days were strange. The employees, who had once seen Dylan only as the driver, now treated him with a mix of curiosity and respect. Some even tried to flatter him, hoping to gain favor with the new heir. "This is crazy," Dylan confided to Eric one evening. "Yesterday I was invisible, and today everyone wants to be my friend." Eric smiled understandingly. "Welcome to my world. You'll learn to tell the sincere from the opportunists." These evening conversations became a ritual for them. Eric shared stories about Isabel, Dylan's mother, and the childhood he had missed. Dylan, in turn, shared memories of his life with James. There were difficult moments too. Dylan sometimes felt overwhelmed by the expectations of being a Vance. Eric, on the other hand, struggled with the temptation to make up for lost years with extravagant gifts and favors. "I don't need a new car, Dad," Dylan said once, the word "dad" still sounding strange in his mouth. "I need time. Time for us to get to know each other, to understand each other." Eric nodded, moved by hearing Dylan call him Dad for the first time. "You're right. I think I'm still learning how to be a father." The legal process of restoring Dylan's identity as Michael Vance was complicated and emotionally draining. They had to relive the kidnapping, the disappearance, the years of separation. The media quickly picked up the story, and for weeks, the Vance family was all over the headlines. Dylan struggled with the sudden fame and attention. "How do you deal with it?" he asked Eric one day after fleeing from a group of reporters. "With patience and a good publicist," Eric joked, but then he got serious. "The truth is, we never fully get used to it. But we learn to use the attention for good." That conversation planted a seed in Dylan's mind. He began to think about how he could use his new position to help others. Meanwhile, Chloe tried several times to reach out to Dylan. He responded politely but kept his distance. "I need to find myself first," he would say, "before I can be anything to anyone." As the months passed, Dylan and Eric found their rhythm. They weren't a perfect family, far from it, but they were learning to be father and son. Dylan started calling Eric Dad more often, and every time he did, Eric's heart filled with joy. One day, during one of their evening dinners, Dylan presented an idea to Eric. "What if we used our story, our second chance, to help other separated families?" Eric listened attentively as Dylan explained his plan for a foundation that would help reunite families and provide support to victims of kidnapping. "Dylan," Eric said, tears in his eyes, "I'm so proud of the man you've become. Your mother would be too." That night, father and son worked late into the evening, planning what would become their joint project, a way to turn their pain into something positive for the world. Their journey of acceptance and reconciliation was far from over, but Dylan and Eric knew that together, they could overcome any obstacle. The future, once so uncertain, now gleamed with possibilities.